Usually when we talk about the concept of debt, we tend to think of it as something highly visible, right? Like something empirical.
Right, yeah, like a mortgage document or a credit card statement.
Exactly. Or, a bold number flashing on a digital screen. It's math.
Hmm.
And I think, more importantly, it's external to our bodies.
Oh, absolutely. It's entirely quantifiable. You can point to it, you can track the interest, and you know exactly what the balance is at any given moment of the day.
But then you step out of the financial realm and into the world of human relationships and memory. And suddenly that accounting becomes completely invisible.
Yeah, really does.
We're looking at this landscape of ledgers that is just hidden from the outside world.
Yeah.
Yet it's carried entirely within the physical body and the architecture of the mind.
Which is fascinating because that internal accounting is the absolute definition of a compound interest trap. But because the interest is paid in the currency of physiological stress and, cognitive load, we often just don't realize how deep in debt we actually are.
Right. Not until the system starts breaking down anyway.
Exactly.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're taking on a mission that is both deeply clinical and intensely universally human. We're exploring the architecture of forgiveness.
And this is such an important topic.
It really is. And I want to be incredibly clear with you, the listener, right up front. We are not talking about the cheap, popular version of forgiveness.
Yeah, not at all.
We're not talking about emotional amnesia or just pushing down your feelings to quote-unquote move on, or rushing back into a toxic environment just because society or a community told you it's the noble thing to do.
Yeah, because that softened, counterfeit version of forgiveness, it actually inflicts massive harm on people.
It does.
What we are exploring today is the rigorous, validated process of releasing the moral ledger, the one that dictates a person's life after they've been profoundly harmed. It's a targeted extraction of a grievance that has taken root.
To do this, we're pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources. We're looking at the foundational work of clinical trailblazers, researchers and psychologists like Robert Enright, Everett Worthington, Fred Luskin, Michael McCullough, and Nathaniel Wade.
Some of the biggest names in the field?
Right. And we were interweaving their empirical data with the insights of profound thinkers and survivors, like Smedes, Corrie ten Boom, and even Ralph Waldo Emerson.
It's a remarkable collection of material to synthesize,
Okay.
mostly because it bridges this vast gap between raw human suffering and empirical physiological science.
Right, like what actually happens in the body.
Exactly. We're looking at what happens to the human animal when it's wounded and how it is biologically and psychologically programmed to respond.
The hook here, the reality that draws you into this research immediately, is that everyone listening to this experiences unforgiveness long before they ever think about it as an academic or clinical concept.
Oh, for sure.
You meet it as a physical sensation. You're just going about your day, maybe driving or washing dishes, and a name comes up in conversation.
Or a certain song plays.
Yeah, a song. And your entire body shifts before your conscious mind even has time to reason. A memory simply arrives uninvited. A sentence that you should have said 5 years ago suddenly forms in your head, perfectly articulated this time.
The old case reopens, the defense is rehearsed, the mind just keeps returning to the scene of the crime because something there still feels unsettled.
It feels fundamentally unpaid.
Right. And the framework the researchers use to describe this cognitive loop is fascinating. The mind, essentially, is maintaining two distinct active ledgers at all times.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics behind that, because the metaphor of the ledger explains so much of our daily anxiety.
It really does.
The first ledger is the one that says, you owe me. This is the debt that belongs to the person who lied to you, betrayed you, abandoned you, or simply failed to love you with the baseline care that you required.
You're carrying their negative balance.
Exactly. But the second ledger is perhaps even heavier. It says, I owe and I will owe forever. And this is the debt carried against the self.
That's a heavy one.
It's a person rehearsing intense remorse for a past mistake, as if feeling terrible could somehow become a literal form of restitution.
And both ledgers require an immense amount of cognitive energy to maintain. I mean, the mind has to constantly audit the past, ensuring the debts aren't forgotten, because, well, evolutionary biology tells us that forgetting a debt makes us vulnerable to being exploited again.
Right. It makes me think of an internal courtroom where you're serving as the judge, the jury, the prosecuting attorney, and sometimes the defendant.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
And the ultimate tragedy of this setup is that the person who caused the wound, the one who betrayed you, They aren't even in the room.
No, they're completely oblivious.
Right. They might be living happily across the country, or they might not even be alive anymore. But your trial resumes every single day. The gavel bangs, court is in session, and you are trapped in there relitigating a past that just cannot be changed.
And that courtroom is exhausting to sustain. Whether the ledger is held against someone else or against yourself, it runs on the exact same cognitive machinery. Shutting down that machinery is incredibly difficult, which is why we have to start by looking at what it's actually doing to us.
Which brings us to the core biological question. If we are all running these internal courtrooms, what is the physical cost? I mean, to dismantle unforgiveness, we first have to understand its mechanism, right? We have to look under the hood of the brain.
Yeah, to understand unforgiveness clinically, we have to recognize that it's not just a fleeting emotion. You don't merely feel unforgiving for a split second. It is defined in the literature as a maintained internal state.
Maintained, meaning it takes work.
Exactly. It's a self-sustaining loop consisting of recollection, appraisal, and physiological arousal. The researchers call the cognitive engine driving this loop rumination.
Let's dive into rumination, because neurologically, this is where the trap snaps shut.
Yeah.
Rumination involves the brain's default mode network. When you're not actively focused on a task, your brain defaults to scanning for unresolved problems. It's like a cow chewing its cud, bringing the material up, chewing it, swallowing it, and bringing it up again.
That's a very vivid image, but it's totally accurate.
Your brain reactivates the memory of the betrayal and triggers the accompanying stress response entirely on its own, often without any external trigger in your environment at all.
And the crucial thing to understand about that loop is the underlying motivation. Michael McCullough's work is vital here. We do not ruminate and hold on to grudges because we are morally defective, petty, or broken.
McCullough studies revenge and forgiveness as evolutionary twins, right? Operating side by side in the human psyche.
Yes. You see that protective mechanism play out throughout evolutionary history in our ancestral environment, signaling that you would aggressively retaliate if harmed was a primary way to deter exploitation.
It kept you and your kin alive.
Exactly. If someone stole your resources and you did nothing, you became an easy target. Revenge, or the threat of it, was a survival mechanism. But forgiveness evolved right alongside it to preserve valuable, necessary cooperation.
Because you still needed each other.
Right. If a member of your tribe slighted you, but you absolutely needed them to help hunt or defend the camp, you needed a psychological mechanism to repair the breach and restore the alliance. Both systems are hardwired into us for survival.
Framing it that way gives our everyday struggles so much dignity, I think. When you're sitting in traffic, furious, rehearsing what you want to say to the colleague who took credit for your work, you aren't crazy.
No, you're balancing competing survival systems.
Resentment starts out as a deeply protective shield. Your brain is essentially screaming, remember this pain, record every detail of this betrayal so you are never caught off guard and harmed like this again.
But the tragedy of the human condition is how that protective function mutates over time. What begins as a necessary shield slowly becomes a psychological possession.
Right.
The brain shifts from remember this so you aren't harmed again to return to this because this grievance is who you are now. The story of the grievance might be 100% factually true. The betrayal was real, the pain was unjustified. But a true story still imprisons you once it becomes the only narrative you're allowed to live inside.
The wound stops being a memory of an event and becomes an address.
Oh, yeah.
You literally live there. Your mail is forwarded there. And the physical cost of living at the address of a past wound is staggering. This brings us to Charlotte vanOyen Witvliet's study at Hope College, which really maps the biological toll of this residency.
Witvliet's research is a landmark study in the psychophysiology of forgiveness. She brought participants into a laboratory and wired them up to a suite of physiological sensors.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, she instructed them to think of a real historical offender from their own lives, someone who had genuinely hurt them. In one experimental condition, she asked them to actively rehearse the hurt, to nurse the grudge, dwell on the unfairness, and lean into the anger.
And in the other
condition, she asked them to imagine granting forgiveness and cultivating empathy for the offender as a flawed human.
And the body kept the score in real time. I want to look at the specific metrics she tracked because it perfectly illustrates the mind-body connection. She was monitoring the autonomic nervous system, which controls our involuntary bodily functions.
Right, the stuff we don't consciously control.
When we perceive a threat, the sympathetic branch of that system triggers the fight-or-flight response.
And the activation was immediate. When participants rehearsed the grudge, their heart rates climbed significantly, their blood pressure rose. Skin conductance, which measures the microsweat on the skin and is a direct index of sympathetic nervous system arousal, spiked.
Unbelievable.
The brain was signaling that the historical offender was currently in the room, posing an immediate physical threat. She even used electromyography to measure the corrugator muscle of the brow.
The corrugator muscle, that's the specific muscle responsible for drawing the eyebrows downward and inward. It's the scowl muscle.
Yes, exactly.
Their bodies were physically contorting into a scowl from the memory alone. But the detail in Witvliet's data that should give everyone pause is what happened during the recovery period. When the researchers told the participants to stop thinking about the grudge and relax, their physiological elevations persisted.
Yeah, that's the scariest part.
The body did not stand down just because the conscious thought ended.
The residual arousal demonstrates that unforgiveness functions as a chronic stress response. Everett Worthington frames this biological reality around cortisol. When you maintain a grudge, you are giving your endocrine system a standing instruction to keep cortisol and adrenaline flowing.
It's constantly flooding the system.
Right. And over time, this constant flooding creates what clinicians call allostatic load.
So if my anger feels like a shield, are you saying the shield is actually slowly crushing me? Allostatic load is the cumulative biological wear and tear of being stressed too often and for too long. Your system is never allowed to return to a true baseline.
It damages your cardiovascular system, impairs your immune regulation, and even shrinks the hippocampus in the brain, which, affects memory and emotional regulation.
It's exactly like paying high compounding interest on a massive financial debt that someone else incurred.
Yes.
The offender racked up the charges by hurting you, but your body's the one paying the daily physiological interest.
But the contrast in the study provides the way out. When those same participants shifted their thoughts to empathy and imagined forgiving the offender, their bodily metrics returned to baseline. The autonomic nervous system relaxed, the body stopped paying the interest.
So, if the empirical data proves that holding onto the grudge is literally destroying our biology, breaking down our hearts and our immune systems, why does letting go feel so incredibly dangerous? Why do we fight the cure so hard?
It's a great question.
The sources make it abundantly clear we resist because society has fed us a deeply flawed, counterfeit definition of forgiveness.
We have blurred the lines of what the construct actually means, and a blurred definition does immense psychological damage. The soft, popular version of forgiveness often pressures people to just let it go, be the bigger person, and move on. Clinically, that instruction usually amounts to suppression.
And suppression is a disaster.
Yeah.
I want to explain the mechanics of why suppression fails so spectacularly, drawing on something called ironic process theory.
Oh, the white bear problem.
Yes, the white bear problem. If I tell you, do whatever you want, but absolutely do not think of a white bear, your brain has to continuously monitor your thoughts to ensure you aren't thinking of a white bear.
Right.
By monitoring for the thought, you are inadvertently forcing your brain to keep the white bear front and center. When we try to suppress a grievance to perform forgiveness, we actually increase the intensity and frequency of the intrusive thoughts.
The suppression creates a rebound effect. But beyond the mechanical failure of suppression, the deeper obstacle to forgiveness is rarely just stubborn bitterness. It is almost always fear.
Fear that if I release the anger, I am somehow retroactively agreeing that the wrong wasn't that big of a deal, like I'm invalidating my own pain.
Exactly. The wounded person fears that release is merely denial in a socially acceptable disguise. They fear that stopping the internal punishment means pretending the harm never mattered, or worse, inviting the harm to happen again. So the clinical pioneers in this field had to forge a razor-sharp exclusionary definition of forgiveness before they could even begin studying how to achieve it.
Let's lay out that foundational definition. Forgiveness is the deliberate internal release of resentment and the right to retaliation against someone who has wronged you. It is a targeted extraction of the vengeance motive, undertaken truthfully, without denying the severity of the wrong, without excusing the behavior, and without requiring any form of reconciliation.
That rigorous definition is the only way to make the process safe. To fully grasp this construct, we have to systematically clear away the counterfeits. We have to look at the 5 things forgiveness is explicitly not.
Let's clear away the debris, starting with the most common misconception. People often conflate the concept with amnesia. They believe forgiveness is not remembering.
The demand to forgive and forget is biologically absurd and psychologically dangerous. Memory carries vital protective information. If you forget a pattern of harm, you cannot establish safe limits for the future.
Which brings to mind Desmond Tutu's philosophy.
Highly relevant here. Having navigated the systemic horrors of apartheid in South Africa, he vehemently insisted that forgiving is not forgetting. It is remembering the atrocity with complete clarity and then actively choosing not to utilize your right to retaliate.
You aren't trying to erase the memory.
Right. You are working to change the role that the memory is permitted to play in your present life.
But what about when we try to soften the memory to make it less painful? People often say things like, well, my boss was just under a massive amount of pressure, or my partner had a terrible childhood, so they couldn't help it. That leads to the second counterfeit. Forgiveness is not excusing.
Right, because to excuse a behavior is to claim that the offender was not truly accountable. You're arguing that mitigating circumstances remove their moral agency. You can certainly have empathy and understand the traumatic background that led someone to hurt you, but understanding the root cause does not absolve them of the responsibility for the action.
Explanation is not absolution.
Perfectly said. You do not have to downgrade a profound wrong into a harmless mistake in order to forgive it.
Which brings up the most dangerous confusion of all, and this is where the popular narrative gets people hurt. The pressure to restore the relationship. The third counterfeit is that forgiveness is not reconciliation.
The distinction between the internal state and the external relationship is the bedrock of the clinical models. Fred Luskin, who directed the Stanford Forgiveness Projects, and Louis Smedes both emphasize this as an unbreakable rule. Forgiveness takes one person, reconciliation takes two.
Here is where it gets really interesting. When we conflate forgiveness with reconciliation, we inadvertently hand a powerful weapon directly to abusers.
Yeah, we really do.
If the cultural narrative is good, moral people forgive, and true forgiveness means we go back to the way things were, then a corrupt institution, a toxic family system, or an abusive partner can weaponize the language of forgiveness to trap a wounded person in a dangerous environment.
They use your desire to heal as the very chain that binds you to the source of the harm.
Recognizing that distinction is a literal lifesaver. You possess the absolute right to forgive someone internally, to rid your own body of the cortisol and the allostatic load, while simultaneously deciding to never speak to them again. You can forgive and permanently decline to restore their access to your life.
And tied directly to that access is the concept of reliance, the fourth counterfeit. Forgiveness is not trust.
Because trust concerns future behavior.
Exactly. Trust is entirely forward-looking. It's an estimation of future reliability, and it must be rebuilt through demonstrated, consistent behavior over a significant period of time. When an offender says, if you really forgave me, you would trust me again, they're collapsing two entirely different psychological concepts, usually in an attempt to escape the grueling, unglamorous work of earning that trust back.
Finally, we arrive at the idea of justice. The fifth counterfeit is that forgiveness is not removing consequences. You can fully forgive someone in your heart and still file the divorce papers.
Yes.
You can release your internal resentment and still fire the employee who embezzled from your company. You can forgive a perpetrator and still testify truthfully against them in a court of law to ensure they face sentencing.
Louis Smedes draws a profound philosophical distinction here between vengeance and justice. Vengeance is the primal desire to see someone suffer simply for the sake of their suffering. Justice is the pursuit of a fair penalty paid to restore moral equity. When you undertake the work of forgiveness, you are giving up the desire for vengeance. You do not have to surrender the pursuit of justice.
So now that we've cleared away what forgiveness isn't, once we are absolutely certain that we do not have to forget the offense, excuse the behavior, reconcile with the abuser, blindly trust them, or drop the necessary consequences, how do clinicians actually teach people to do what it is?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because the number one objection therapists hear is, I understand the concept, but I just don't feel like forgiving them. I'm still too angry.
Everett Worthington's research addresses that exact hurdle by separating the process into two distinct phenomena: decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness. He argues that waiting until you feel like forgiving is a trap, because the feelings are the very last thing to change.
Worthington tells us we don't have to feel it yet. Decisional forgiveness is a behavioral intention. It is a conscious, executive choice made by your will today to release the debt and forego revenge. You are stating an intention.
Right.
Emotional forgiveness, on the other hand, is the slow, largely involuntary replacement of negative hot emotions with neutral or mildly positive ones. It arrives on its own schedule. The emotional shift could take months, years, or decades.
The sequence is vital. The decision must precede the emotion. A powerful historical example of this dynamic is the story of Corrie ten Boom.
Her story illustrates the mechanics of this perfectly. Corrie ten Boom and her family hid Jewish refugees in their home in the Netherlands during the Holocaust.
Oh.
They were caught, and she and her sister were sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Her sister died there under horrific conditions.
It's an unimaginable trauma.
Years after the war, Corrie was in Munich giving a public address on the necessity of God's forgiveness. After the talk, a man approached her. She instantly recognized him. He had been one of the most cruel SS guards at Ravensbrück. He told her he had become a Christian, asked for her forgiveness, and physically extended his hand to her.
She was suddenly confronted with the ultimate test of the very message she had just delivered. The man who represented the torture and death of her sister was standing in front of her with his hand out.
She wrote vividly about the internal paralysis of that moment. She noted that she felt absolutely nothing resembling warmth, grace, or forgiveness. She felt a freezing coldness and a surge of anger.
Which is completely understandable.
Completely. But she understood the clinical and spiritual principle of forgiveness is an act of the will, not an emotional reflex. So she made the mechanical decision. She forced her arm to lift, and she grasped the former guard's hand. And she reported that it was only after she made the physical, decisional movement that a current of warmth and release seemed to pass through her arm and into her heart.
The feeling followed the physical act of the will. It did not precede it.
She acted with her executive function first, bypassing the immediate emotional resistance. That foundational concept that the will leads and the emotions slowly follow is baked into the three major clinical models of forgiveness that dominate modern psychotherapeutic research.
Let's examine the mechanics of these models. The first is Robert Enright's process model. Time magazine actually referred to Enright as the forgiveness trailblazer because he was one of the first to map this mathematically.
So how does Enright map it out?
He maps the journey across 4 distinct phases: uncovering, decision, work, and deepening. What makes Enright's model so robust is his approach to the uncovering phase. He doesn't treat anger as the enemy of forgiveness. He treats it as the first honest witness to the crime.
That reframing is so important. You have to meticulously uncover exactly how badly you were hurt. You cannot forgive a vague sense of unease. You have to define the dimensions of the wound.
Right, you can't bypass it.
You move through the anger, allowing it to show you what was taken, rather than trying to bypass it with toxic positivity. Once the anger has testified, you can move into the decision phase.
Following Enright is Everett Worthington's model, known as the RECH model. REACH, it's an acronym, and it remains the most widely tested forgiveness intervention globally.
Let's break down the acronym. R stands for recall the hurt, but specifically to recall it as objectively as possible without embellishing the villainy of the offender or wallowing in victimization.
Yeah, sticking to the facts.
E is empathize with the offender. A is the altruistic gift of forgiveness, recognizing times you yourself have needed grace. C is commit to the forgiveness, usually by writing it down or sharing it with a trusted friend to make it tangible. And H is hold on when the feelings of anger inevitably return.
Worthington frames this entire multi-step process around a brilliant concept he calls the injustice gap. The injustice gap is the perceived distance between the reality of what happened to you and how things would be if perfect, ideal justice were executed.
Right. So if someone steals $20 from you, the injustice gap is relatively small. You can close it easily. If someone destroys your career or fractures your family, the injustice gap is massive. The larger that gap, the more cognitive and emotional labor is required to bridge it through the RECH steps.
Exactly. And the third framework comes from Fred Luskin at Stanford, the grievance story framework.
Let's talk about Luskin's approach.
Luskin's approach focuses heavily on cognitive behavioral principles, specifically how we construct and maintain our memories. He posits that a grievance story is not merely a passive memory. It's a highly organized, frequently repeated narrative account of who is entirely at fault, how we were victimized, and why we are permanently trapped by their actions.
But Luskin's clinical work doesn't ask people to change the facts of what happened. The facts remain immutable. Instead, he helps people transition from a grievance story to a forgiveness story by changing the role the narrative is permitted to play in their emotional life. You shift from being the helpless victim of a past event to the hero of your own recovery.
It's a powerful shift.
It is. Now, I want to pause and push back on something we mentioned earlier, because when I first read through Worthington's RECH model, I tripped hard over the empathize.
Oh, a lot of people do.
I mean, if someone fundamentally betrayed my trust, lied to my face, and blew up my life, why is it my job to muster empathy for them? It feels like the victim is being asked to perform grueling emotional labor for the sole benefit of the person who stabbed them in the back.
That is exactly where most people stop reading. It's a massive psychological hurdle. But the clinical guardrail here is crucial to understand. Empathy, in the context of forgiveness, is not about excusing the offense, and it is absolutely not meant to comfort or benefit the offender. Empathy is an internal tool designed exclusively for the forgiver's freedom.
Walk us through the mechanism of how showing empathy to a betrayer actually frees the victim.
When someone inflicts profound harm on you, your moral imagination immediately simplifies them as a defense mechanism. To protect your psyche, your brain shrinks the complexity of that person down until they are nothing more than the sum total of the act that hurt you.
They become a caricature.
Right. They are stripped of their humanity and become a two-dimensional villain. In the immediate aftermath of trauma, that simplification is necessary for survival. It keeps you away from them. But long-term, if you keep them frozen in your mind as a 2D symbol of your pain, your own psychological wound stays frozen right there alongside them.
They become a cartoon villain, and you become trapped in the comic book with them.
That's a great way to put it. To humanize the offender, to force yourself to acknowledge that they might be profoundly weak, operating out of fear, or acting out of their own unexamined generational trauma, unfreezes them.
But it doesn't make it okay.
No, it does not make their wrongful action acceptable, and it does not mean you have to invite them to dinner, but it completes the picture of reality.
Right.
It frees you from being permanently tethered to a monster of your own mind's creation.
That makes perfect sense. The empathy is a tool to dismantle the power they hold over my mind. And it's important to note, according to a massive meta-analysis conducted by researcher Nathaniel Wade, these models aren't just nice philosophical self-help ideas, they are rigorously validated psychotherapeutic interventions.
Yes, the data is very clear.
Wade's data showed that people who systematically go through these frameworks experience measurable, sustained drops in clinical depression and generalized anxiety.
The evidence base is undeniable. When applied correctly, these cognitive interventions work. They heal the body and the mind.
But all of these models, Enright, Worthington, Luskin, they sound very clean and linear in a textbook. What happens when the theories hit the hardest cases, when the injury is massive or systemic or the abuse is ongoing? How do you apply a clinical model to something that seems utterly unforgivable?
This is where the clinical and ethical cautions of the profession become paramount. Forgiveness must never be rushed, and it must never be coerced by a therapist, a religious leader, or a family member. Furthermore, forgiveness is never the first intervention when there is ongoing danger. Safety is always the prerequisite.
Safety first, always.
Physical protection, geographic separation, and psychological stabilization have to precede any conversation about forgiveness.
And for massive wounds, atrocities, the harm of a child, profound betrayals of the marital vow, the sources emphasize that the psychological process of lament must come first. You have to systematically grieve the full weight of what was taken from you.
Yes.
The friends or family members who show up immediately after a tragedy and say, well, at least you learned a valuable lesson, or everything happens for a reason, they're not helping you move toward forgiveness. They are utilizing toxic positivity to ease their own profound discomfort with your unresolved pain.
Rushing to a tidy philosophical meaning is a form of avoidance. It is a refusal to sit in the ashes with the wounded person.
Everett Worthington, the very architect of the RUCH model we just discussed, had to test his theories in the darkest, most unimaginable way possible. In 1996, on New Year's Eve, Worthington's mother was murdered in a brutal home invasion.
It is a staggering tragedy. Worthington had spent his entire professional career meticulously building the science of forgiveness. He was the global expert. And suddenly, his own life became the ultimate, horrifying test case.
Wow, I can't even imagine.
He wrote very openly and vulnerably about the immediate aftermath. He described an intense, visceral desire for revenge that rose up in him. He vividly visualized taking a baseball bat to the perpetrators. The man who built the foremost forgiveness model discovered just how far his own human heart was from the clinical ideal when the blood was his own.
He realized that having a PhD in forgiveness did not make him immune to the evolutionary drive for vengeance. He had to take his own acronym, the R80H steps, and apply them, painfully, slowly, and non-linearly, to the worst thing that had ever happened to his family. He had to recall the horror, attempt to empathize with the brokenness of the youths who broke into the home, grant the altruistic gift, and commit to the release.
His journey proves that the model was not just cooked up in a sterile academic lab using hypotheticals. It was forged and validated in the absolute worst crucible of human experience. If the framework can hold up to that level of atrocity, it possesses the structural integrity to handle our deepest wounds.
So how do we actually do this in our own lives? We promised a step-by-step practice for the listener. Let's synthesize these various clinical models, the boundary setting, and the emotional processing into a cohesive 7-step protocol. Think of this as a map for closing the ledger.
The journey begins with naming the injury in writing. You cannot forgive a ghost. You have to describe factually what was done, by whom, and what it specifically cost you. This requires rigorous honesty, no minimizing the damage to seem tough, but also no inflating it with dramatic, catastrophic language to seem more aggrieved. You need an accurate, true-size record of the debt.
Right. Once the debt is accurately measured, step 2 is you must let the anger and grief be witnessed. Anger is a necessary bodyguard, but underneath the anger is usually a profound well of loss. The loss of a future you had expected, the loss of your sense of safety, the loss of your own innocence. You have to deeply grieve that secondary loss before you can ever attempt to release the primary event.
Which is so critical. Once the grief is acknowledged, you move to step 3, making the explicit decision. This is the decisional forgiveness we discussed with Corrie 10 and 10. Do not wait for the warm feelings. Write down a dated, concrete statement, declaring your intention to release the debt and renouncing revenge as the organizing principle of your life.
Then comes the arduous work of step 4, reframing the offender, the empathy step. Acknowledge them as a whole, flawed, perhaps deeply traumatized human being so they don't remain a frozen, omnipotent monster in your mind. However, the clinicians offer a vital caveat here. If the wound is fresh, defer this step.
Yeah, don't force it too soon.
Do not rush to empathize while you are still bleeding.
Yeah.
Wait until stabilization occurs.
The next phase, step 5, is absolutely critical for long-term success. Set boundaries. Forgiveness is an internal change of heart. Boundaries are external rules of engagement. Decide clearly what level of access this person will have to you going forward. Will you allow contact? Will you share finances? Will you offer trust? Write the limits down.
This step illuminates the brilliance of the entire system. By setting an ironclad external boundary, you actually make the internal release of forgiveness safe to perform. Think of it like a castle.
A castle. I like that.
Yeah, if I know my external fortress walls are secure, the drawbridge is up, and you cannot get back in to hurt me, well, it is finally safe for me to put down my heavy armor and sword inside the courtyard. I can relax internally because I'm protected externally. The boundary enables the peace.
That analogy perfectly captures the dual nature of protection and release, which leads directly to step 6, evaluating reconciliation. This must be done completely separately from forgiveness. Does the offender acknowledge the specific harm they caused? Have they demonstrated measurable, consistent change over a long period of time? If the answer is no, your internal forgiveness still stands, but reconciliation does not follow. The relationship remains closed.
And finally, step 7, the ongoing work, hold on through recurrence. You will be triggered. A song will play on the radio, an anniversary or holiday will roll around, or you will smell a certain cologne and the fury will flare up as if the offense happened yesterday. You don't panic. You simply reaffirm the dated decision you made earlier.
We have spent a significant amount of time analyzing the ledger of what others owe us. But as we established at the beginning, there is a second ledger. And in clinical practice, psychologists often find that it is the one ledger people find genuinely impossible to close.
We're talking about the mirror. How to navigate the grueling landscape of forgiving yourself.
The debt carried against the self is uniquely heavy because there is no external offender to confront or establish distance from. You are trapped in the body with the perpetrator. Self-forgiveness is notoriously difficult because human nature typically drives us to fail in one of two opposite directions.
People tend to fall off the horse on either the left side or the right side. On one side, you have the trap of self-excuse. This is pure avoidance. A person desperately wants the psychological peace of forgiveness without having to face the real-world consequences of their actions.
Right, they just want an easy out.
Exactly. They might misuse therapy language, claiming they need to protect their peace to avoid the grueling work of repairing the damage they inflicted on someone else's life.
It is the demand for a clean slate and a new identity without the prerequisite of confession and restitution. But the other side of the horse is just as common and, in many ways, more deeply insidious, the trap of self-condemnation.
This is a tough one to watch.
It really is. This is the individual who has faced the truth, sincerely apologized, made whatever repairs were possible, and accepted the consequences, but they continue to ruthlessly punish themselves year after year. They wear permanent self-hatred as a badge of moral seriousness.
It's a twisted logic that says, look how much I loathe myself, look how miserable I am. That misery proves to the world that I understand the gravity of my mistake.
It looks like humility, but it is actually a form of psychological captivity. And ironically, it carries a hidden, profound self-absorption. Even when you are actively hating yourself, you are still keeping the self at the absolute center of the narrative. You are obsessed with your own failure rather than the needs of the community you inhabit.
Lewis Smedes draws a distinction here that I think is the master key to unlocking this specific trap. He articulates the vital difference between guilt and shame.
This is such an important distinction.
Guilt is a highly productive emotion when handled correctly. Guilt says, I did something wrong. It is specific to an event, localized in time, and most importantly, it is actionable. You can apologize for an action.
Right.
Shame, however, is a disease of identity. Shame says, I am something wrong. It is global, vague, and entirely paralyzing. Shame rarely produces genuine repair or changed behavior because it speaks in absolute, unchangeable verdicts, I ruin everything I touch, or I am fundamentally unforgivable.
You cannot forgive a self that you are lying about through the inflated, distorted lens of shame. You have to shrink the monster back down to historical reality. You have to say, I didn't ruin everything in my entire life. I specifically lied in that Tuesday afternoon meeting because I was afraid of losing my job. That is specific. You can work with that. You can make amends for that. You can forgive that.
Everett Worthington advises applying the REACH model internally to combat this. The hardest part of self-reach, he notes, is that people can often find the grace to forgive a friend for causing hurt, but they find it impossible to accept that they themselves are the kind of person capable of causing such hurt.
They're grieving their own idealized self-image.
Exactly. Abandoning self-resentment requires holding yourself to strict account while simultaneously extending self-directed beneficence.
But we have to emphasize the requirement of repair. You cannot just forgive yourself in a vacuum and call it a day. The form of the repair has to appropriately match the harm. A careless, cruel word needs a direct apology. Financial theft or negligence needs actual repayment. A pattern of addiction requires submitting to external structure and rehab, not just offering tearful promises to do better next time.
But here's the critical pivot where so many well-meaning people get stuck when full repair is simply impossible. When the damage is done, the relationship is over, or the person you hurt has passed away, the ledger cannot be balanced.
That's a devastating place to be.
It is. In those cases, people believe they have forfeited their right to live freely, so they continue paying for their mistake in the currency of shame.
But paying in the currency of shame is a total dead end. It destroys the person paying it, it exhausts their family, and it does absolutely nothing to fix the past. It's a completely useless currency.
True moral responsibility eventually has to turn outward and forward. It has to stop asking the self-obsessed question, how do I punish myself enough to balance the scales? And start asking the community-focused question, what does repair require of me now? And how do I honor the damage I caused by living a fundamentally different kind of life tomorrow?
I love that pivot toward tomorrow.
I want to bring in Ralph Waldo Emerson here because he captures the daily discipline required to turn forward better than almost anyone. His words are often slapped onto inspirational posters or coffee mugs, but when you read the full text in the context of clinical self-forgiveness, you realize it's not fluffy, feel-good encouragement. It is a strict, demanding mandate.
What's the quote?
Listen to the discipline in this. Finish each day and be done with it. You've done what you could. Some blunders and absurdities no doubt crept in. Forget them as soon as you can. Tomorrow is a new day. You shall begin it serenely and with too high a spirit to be encumbered with your old nonsense.
Encumbered with your old nonsense. It reads as poetic, but it is actually a profound psychological methodology. Emerson is arguing that the day must be decisively finished, the actions must be examined, the specific failures and blunders must be named, apologies must be prepared, and then the trial must be allowed to end. The gavel must come down.
Most of us are very good at the first half of that equation. We lie in bed at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, reviewing our blunders, cataloging every awkward conversation and missed opportunity. But we never execute the executive shift to be done with it. We drag the entire courtroom, the judge, and the jury into tomorrow.
We really do.
Self-forgiveness is the active discipline of refusing to let yesterday become an endless, unadjourned trial.
You extract the lesson and you close the file. Let guilt teach you what you need to know without ever letting shame govern your identity.
So let's look at the long-term reality of this. You do the grueling work. You make the executive decision to forgive the person who betrayed you, or you finish the day and apply Emerson's discipline to forgive yourself. You feel a sense of peace. And then a month later, you wake up at 2 a.m., your heart is racing, the memory is playing like a movie behind your eyes, and the anger is completely back. It is burning just as hot as day one.
Which happens all the time.
Did the forgiveness fail? Were you just lying to yourself the whole time?
Absolutely not. Relapse is the expected, normal course of human memory. Waking up angry does not mean the initial decision to forgive was false or ineffective. It usually means that as you have healed, a brand new layer of the loss has surfaced, requiring its own processing.
That makes a lot of sense.
Worthington built the entire final stage of his EECH model, the hold-on phase, around the empirical reality that forgiveness has to be actively defended against its own cognitive return.
Corrie, who we discussed earlier, admitted this with astonishing vulnerability. She managed to forgive the SS guard in that singular, miraculous moment, but she wrote later that her forgiveness had to be renewed daily, sometimes hourly.
Hourly.
And she even noted a fascinating quirk of human nature. Sometimes the smaller, petty hurts from everyday life, like a rude comment from a neighbor or a minor slight, were actually harder to keep forgiving on a daily basis than the massive historical atrocity.
The objective of forgiveness is not to achieve an unbroken, flawless consistency where you never feel a negative emotion again. The objective is to create a new neural pathway in the mind, a worn track in the forest. Even when you get triggered and fall off the path into the brush of resentment, the path itself does not disappear. Falling away is not a failure of the system. It is simply the environmental cue to return to the path you have already cleared.
You change the nature of the questions you ask yourself in the dark. You ask the operational question, not the accusing one. Instead of demanding, why am I such a failure for being angry about this again? You ask, I see the anger has returned. What will I choose to deliberately set down today?
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of everything we've explored in these clinical models, the evolutionary biology and the personal narratives. The central claim of this entire deep dive is a paradigm shift. Forgiveness is not the erasure of memory. It is a fundamental change in authority.
A change in authority. That is the core of it.
Before you engage in the work of forgiveness, the wound is sovereign. It sits on the throne of your life. It governs the story you tell about yourself. It dictates your identity. It defines your fears. And it sets the hard limits of your future joy. It demands that your cognitive attention keep returning to it, paying homage to the pain.
And after.
After forgiveness, the wound is demoted, it becomes historical. It remains a permanent part of your story, yes. The wrong stays completely true. But it is no longer sovereign. It has been stripped of its executive power. It does not get to author the whole of your life.
The person who caused the harm might have altered the trajectory of your life forever. That is a tragedy you must lament. But they do not get to own your future. The worst moment of your life or the worst mistake you ever made does not get naming rights over the rest of your existence.
When you refuse to do this work, when you leave the invisible ledger open on the desk of your mind, it eventually stops being an accounting book and it becomes a shrine.
A shrine. That is such a haunting, accurate image. You visit the shrine daily. You light the candles of your resentment. You read the entries. You trace your fingers over the debts to prove to yourself that the injury truly mattered. And all the while, your real, vibrant life outside the walls of that shrine is quietly thinning out and passing you by.
We don't do the difficult work of closing the ledger because the entries were false. The entries are entirely true. You were hurt. You were profoundly wronged. The math is correct. We close the ledger because the human mind and the human nervous system were never built to survive as a permanent accountant of pain.
So let's recap this journey for you, the listener. Unforgiveness is an active biological and psychological drain. It spikes your heart rate, floods your system with cortisol, creates dangerous allostatic load, and traps you in a neurological cycle of rumination.
It's exhausting.
True forgiveness is a targeted, decisional process of closing the ledger without denying the math. It requires facing the brutal truth, grieving the secondary losses, drawing hard external boundaries to create internal safety, and utilizing the discipline to finish the day.
And it leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as we conclude. If the human mind was not built to live as a permanent accountant of pain, then consider the sheer amount of mental, emotional, and physical energy that is currently tied up in your own internal ledgers.
Just massive amounts of energy.
Every single day, a huge percentage of your cognitive capital is being spent auditing past debts, protecting the shrine, and rehearsing arguments for a trial that has no judge. If you successfully make the executive decision to close the book on those debts, not because the offense didn't matter, but because yesterday is not final, what entirely new things will your mind finally have the capital to invest in tomorrow?
That invisible compound interest trap we talked about at the very beginning of this hour, you actually have the power to stop paying it. The internal courtroom can be adjourned. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of forgiveness. May you begin your next day serenely, unencumbered by your old nonsense.